about c4, c5, g3, g6. The symmetrical in a way. Black is also fianchettoing his bishop. He doesn't have to play g6 right away if he intends to do so. In many cases he will also start with knight c6 and only here go for g6. Or you sometimes get this kind of position also if we go all the way back. By this move order, c4, g6, when I'm going to suggest g3 as well, and black later decides to play c5. So there are various move orders that could lead to the variation here at hand. What we get almost invariably is this: g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, knight c3, and okay, here by far the main move is knight to c6. The reason is that the knight on b8 very rarely makes any sense on d7 or a6, as knight c6 is connecting to the all-important d4 square. There's very little sense in putting the knight somewhere else. On the other hand, the king's knight, the same applies for white's knight, is something that is a piece where you're not quite sure where to put it. You have many options by both sides. They can go to here, to h6, to f6, to e7. So black usually plays the knight to c6 and only later commits to something on the king side. However, it's easily possible to play knight f6 here. When I'm going to suggest to play with a3, knight c6, rook b1, going for b4. This position we will see later from a different move order. So I'm not going to look at this at this moment. Normally knight c6 happens, keeping the symmetry. In this position, white has a pretty fundamental choice. Popular move is the move knight f3, and it's also a fairly natural move. White is going to castle short anyway, and he puts the knight out. There is one reason why I don't like this move. Actually, there are a couple, but I don't like it so much because I think black now has excellent control over d4, and based on that he can play basically any line. Like d6 is going to be very good equalizing chances, e5, e6. There's a huge range of moves, and all in all I don't like that white is putting the knight on f3, obstructing the long diagonal. We have put an effort in controlling this, and now we block it. I don't like it much. It's not a bad move, of course, in an abstract sense, but I don't like it in the spirit of our repertoire. What else is there? White can play in the center with different setups. He can play e4 for this Botvinnik center, but here black is pretty flexible. He has not played a pawn to e5 and has good control over d4. I don't mind the central or the center type in general, but I think white should only go for it under a special circumstance. We will see one or two later in our overview. Then there's the move e3, which tries to go for knight e2. This is something that I in general like, but e3 has one problem. Black can play e6, just play completely for symmetry, and this is going to be completely boring. Something like this is a well-known super boring line. So this is absolutely not particularly interesting to play. Also there's e3, bishop c3, e3, e5, and all of those. Black is close to equality. So what I'm coming up with is at the end the move a3. The idea of this move is pretty straightforward. White wants to play b4. He wants to play on the flank, often prepared by rook b1, but not in all cases. In some cases we can even play b4 as a pawn sacrifice. Of course a3 is not a move that puts immediate pressure on black, so he has quite a wide range of possibilities that he can go for. The most important moves to check are probably the moves e6, a6 and b6, but there are a couple of others, of course. Let's start with the move that white is absolutely happy to see, the move e5. As I mentioned, this kind of center is often quite solid. this Botvinnik center. However, here white has a very good opportunity. He can play the move b4. This is very strong. White does not invest the move to prepare b4, but plays it right away. The thing is, black absolutely cannot afford to take this pawn. After bishop a3, the position is already very critical for black. For example, knight c6, knight to b5. You see this issue here on d6, bishop f8 for example, and then bishop d6 is very annoying. Threatens knight c7 winning the queen. A position like this here is downright awful for black. White's compensation for just one pawn is fantastic. And you have choices. This is not the only way of punishing this. So let's go all the way back. Taking on b4 is pretty awful. Better is d6. Still, white is definitely happy with this position. Rook b1. Now we can support this, and we go with e3. And yeah, this kind of setup here is quite nice for white. This is a weak square on d5 that we can nicely control now. And yeah, here black's knight got stuck on the edge of the board. This is actually a pretty well-known game between Kasparov and Karpov. Yeah, Karpov somehow stumbled into this position in a World Championship match in Seville 1987. It's very nicely played by Kasparov. Castles, knight b7, and now he played e4. Black was ready to push d5, so e4 blocks all this. It's rather symmetrical in the center here, but white has more space on the queen side. He's got this, I probably should paint a little bit less, he's got more space here with b5. The knight is awful on b7, and in general white has more flexibility in this position. We will see how it went here. If we look at this position, it's a very nice situation for white. Yes, this fantastic piece on g2, a great knight, and the knight on b7 is stuck. Kasparov went on to win a very nice game here against Karpov. So e5 is something after a3 that we absolutely welcome. A pretty bad move. Black sometimes tries the move knight h6. It's also very rare and not something that we should worry about very much. A normal setup with rook b1, yeah, and e3 if he stops it with a5, this b4 push. All those normal moves suffice for a pretty nice position. Yeah, something like this, we control those important squares, and maybe an idea like knight b5 and d4 will open up the position favorably. So we can be quite happy with this. Knight h6 also pretty rare move. A move that is played far more frequently is quite clearly knight to f6. This can also happen from various moves orders, even with one knight f6 or one g6, whatever. It can easily happen that black fianchettos and plays c5, knight c6. I recommend rook b1 again to get in b4. Yeah, black now has a fundamental choice. He can prevent b4 with a5, or he can yeah, he cannot take this option. Castles, for example, is what he can do. And then of course we go b4, and I think white is quite happy with this. He has more space on the queen side, and yeah, in this position it's kind of an interesting idea here from the black player. This is a game between Julian Hodgson and Keith Arkle, where Arkle played this knight here to e5. Hodgson plays a very creative setup against this. Knight to h3, f3, and now drops this back. But it was a nice position here after knight d5, I think. White has more space and later went on to push the e and f pawn forward with a good advantage. Usually after this, black plays a5 to stop b4. It looks quite sensible, this option. Yeah, white plays most normal moves ever. d3, bishop d2, and develops with knight f3. It's a fairly symmetrical position. There's only this difference between those a pawns, and I think this is also what white should try to use now to gain a little bit of an advantage. It's not much, but it's nice. The move I'm recommending is knight to b5. If you try knight e1, this is something that you can do if you happen to play, I don't know, maybe against Magnus Carlsen and you want to make a draw. This is not a bad start for this. If we look at this, this is what usually happens, this kind of vacuum cleaner chess. Everything is pretty much sucked off the board. It's just a totally dead equal position. Yeah, we don't want that. We want a little bit of a fight. Knight b5 is my option, directly trying to go b4. And this is what's going to happen. White will play b4 here. And I believe that white is slightly better here. It's not a lot, but this pawn is somewhat weakish. And we have a good diagonal here to use. Again, black is fairly solid, but it's still something that white can continue to play and try to press for a small advantage. The most popular moves, if we jump back to a3, are the pawn moves, the small pawn moves, a6, b6 and e6. Black can also go d6, for example, but after rook b1 and b4, this will very likely transpose to something else. Let's have a look at a6, the symmetrical line. After a6, white's most popular move is the move rook to b1, which is kind of logical, trying to play b4. And the thing is, black is just doing the same thing. I just want to briefly show you how this starts. It will lead to this kind of position, and then white normally goes knight f3. I've tried to make something happen out of this, but I ultimately failed. Quite clearly this is a super solid option for white, but I couldn't find anything substantial. I think best, by the way, is d5 for black, and possible quick bishop f5. I think black equalizes here. I had a hard time finding something against a6, but I think I have an interesting idea available. I want to suggest the move e3. Yes, you can say, well, we discussed this, and there was e3 earlier as an option, but you said that this is not going to lead to much. Well, I think it's a little bit different here because of a couple of specific reasons. The first thing to check here is the move e6, the symmetrical answer. Against this, now white has a good reply that was not available without the a-pawn moves, and this is the move b4. After b4, I think white has pretty nice play. If black now does not accept the challenge, taking on b4 I mean, then after something like d6, let's say knight e2, I think white is happy with this. We have gotten in a3 b4, and a6 is pretty useless there. Black usually wants to have pawn on a7 and pawn on b6 here, like this kind of structure, and this is now not easily possible anymore. So I think black basically has to pick up the gauntlet somewhat after b4. What can he do? He can take like this, after which white just will play the move d4. A coming bishop a3 and tending knight to e4 to d6 will be excellent compensation for white. I believe that white is better here. His compensation will be absolutely great. Black also can take with the knight. That's an interesting move. Takes, and well, the white knight cannot move as the rook on a1 is hanging. But we can just play knight ge2. And after takes, we again play a position a pawn down. The position, however, is very nice. Knight e7, d4, castles, bishop a3. A position like that, white has excellent compensation. I think that actually white has an advantage here. It's more than enough for the pawn, and the position is very uncomfortable for black to play. Those dark squared weaknesses are a bit of an issue. It's really like a turbocharged Benko gambit, Volga gambit. So I believe after a3, a6, e3, and then e6, b4 is quite nice. What else does black have? He can try rook b8, trying to accelerate that b5 play. I believe after knight e2, b5, and this kind of line, that white is slightly more comfortable. It's not a big deal, but I think if we look at this very logical looking line, that white is slightly more comfortable. After b4 he has the trick queen b3, and if d6, we're just going to develop with bishop g5. We have some play on the e-file against this pawn, and there's also knight a2 to b4 as a potential option to exploit the weak c6 square. I believe we can be quite happy with this. After e3, black also has a third option that can be considered. In this position without the a pawns played, black sometimes takes on c3. A somewhat unconventional solution. We see something similar later. Here this is not good at all, because a key idea after taking is that black will often play b6, bishop b7 and castle long. But this is absolutely not playable with the pawn being on a7, so that on a6 with the rook on b1 there will be pressure against b6 here. So this is not an option at all in this kind of position. So I think that e3 is an interesting reply to the move a6. Yeah, it's not going to be a quick win for white, but it's definitely an interesting option that is totally unknown. I have to mention. So what is black going to do? We have looked at most moves, but not all of them. e6 and b6 are also quite popular. My main choice here for this overview is e6, but I will also show you b6. After b6, white has a choice. He can play b4 immediately, or he can delay that a little bit to a later moment. I like to delay it actually and prioritize the development of the king side, but there is of course nothing particularly wrong with going b4. Like b4, bishop b7, rook b1, d6, knight f3, queen d7. This kind of setup. This is very comparable to what we will get from 5e6, which we're going to look at later. Yeah, black is very close to equality here if we have to be entirely honest. Yeah, it's a very solid setup. Instead, I like the move e3 a little bit more. I think it's a bit trickier. Why exactly? Yeah, first of all, black is again able to play the move bishop takes e3, an idea I mentioned earlier. Here this is better than before when there was a pawn on a6, but still I think we don't need to be very much afraid. What we need to know is the right setup here. No matter what black plays, and usually plays f5 or bishop b7, white should opt for a setup with d3 and later e4. This is occupying the center and making sure that the c4 pawn is very safe. And a setup with d4 is totally wrong here, as that would weaken c4 far too much. So how to do this? e3 takes f5, d3 is the move, knight f6, and now knight to h3. I know it looks strange, but it is a strategically very strong move. The idea is that white is preparing this e4 setup. This is the way you want to set up against this capture on c3. The pawn formation in the center is totally safe now, and we can play on the flanks. There are options like this, knight g5, knight f4, even at the right moment some pawn expansion on the king side is possible. Here white is a bit better, but it's important to know the central setup. Going back, black might also play here, and now we can look quickly at a game between Michal Gurevich and Philipp Schlosser. Gurevich is a great expert on the English Open, and he goes for this setup as well, e4 and d3. Yeah, he put a knight on e2 here and had, I think, a slight advantage here in this position. He had good control over d5, and he has ideas on the king side later. So the capture on c3 is not something that we need to be afraid of. What should black play? Normal move here could be e6. But after e6 we have an interesting move d4. Yeah, exploiting this diagonal. If black now snatches, then knight e5 is excellent for white. It's a pretty bad idea to grab this pawn. So I think d4 is a very interesting option against e6. The most popular move, of course, is e3 to just play bishop b7, after which I suggest knight to e2. Yeah, let's say knight f6, castles, castles, b4. So we play this setup with b4, but with knight being on e2 and the pawn on e3 instead of it being on f3. And I think this is a little bit more interesting. A typical idea could be this. Now after knight e5, of course, white is not trading pieces but plays the move e4, going for a delayed Botvinnik setup in a case where this bishop is not particularly well placed to fight this, and white is out for f4 later and has a nice space advantage. I think white can be quite happy with this. So after a3, to sum up, after b6 we go e3, after a6 we go e3. What happens after e6 here? Yeah, here I suggest to further prepare b4. The immediate b4 is a little bit weaker than the version that we saw earlier where a6 was played. It is playable, but probably not 100% sound. If we look at something like this, yeah, it's believable that this is some compensation for white, but I'm not sure that it is actually more than enough. Maybe it's enough, it's kind of borderline. I think better is to play the move rook to b1. So just prepare, oops, didn't want that, rook b1, just prepare the move b4. Yeah, black usually plays knight e7, or you can go a5. a5, I think it makes some sense to start with e4 now and clamp down on e5. This weakened b5 square is giving white some additional options. If we look at something like this, we will play bishop e3 invariably, trying to play d4. Whenever black tries to prevent that by putting a knight on d4 himself, we can actually take and use that weakened square. So after a5 is being played, I think e4 gains a little bit in strength. The most popular way of playing for black is just to play knight to e7. So knight here, b4 and d6. Yeah, and here the question is, do we want to play e3 or not? We actually want to play it in general, e3, knight e2 and so on, as we have seen earlier, but in this particular position I'm a little bit irritated by the move knight to e5. Yeah, now knight e2 is not possible and the pawn is hanging. So I think in this particular move order we probably have to go knight f3. It's not the end of the world, but as we have seen earlier, we would prefer to play e3, knight e2, but it just doesn't work here. Yeah, here black is usually playing b6 or castles. It leads to the same thing. If we go with castles here, the next move will be b6. So black is going for this very flexible setup here that is completed with the moves bishop b7 and usually queen to queen to d7. This is a fairly slowish kind of game, of course. But what you should not underestimate is that there are absolutely all pieces on the board. So you can always get a fight out of these positions by simply trying to find resources in those positions with all the pieces on the board. It's always going to be complicated. It's not a totally dry position, let's say, where everything gets traded. It's not that kind of equality. I actually think that black is equal here, but it's a complicated equality. For example, here, just to show what's possible, black could go for d5 here. All of a sudden, opening up the position after taking, and b takes c5, black would have bishop a6. And here I think white can sacrifice an exchange for pretty nice compensation. I think I actually would prefer white here. d5 is weak. We have a good bishop pair. This is a line like on move 18, so don't take this too seriously. It's not going to happen every game. It just shows that there can be interesting complications from those positions at any given moment. After d5 you can also play d3, by the way, without having any issues. So queen d7 is what's normally done, and I suggest bishop g2, rook c8, d3. Yeah, as mentioned, it's a position with absolutely nothing traded yet. So we have 32 pieces spawns on the board and lots of play and lots of ideas left. It is, I think, a very good line, the c4, c5.